Hi guys, this is John Edward Willie, and I'm wanting to talk to you about politics. Now I know everybody and their brother is talking about politics, but I'd like to step a step back, maybe 10,000 steps back, maybe 1,000,000,000,000 steps back, and ask a little bit bigger questions about the nature of politics. I think it's helpful. I think it's highly unhelpful, as there is clearly a sense in which we become more lost the more we think about the age and the era that we're living in. And so I suppose that's the first question I have. I ask questions as sort of as ways of organizing my thinking. There's a power that comes with a good question. It's not really that every question is a good question. That's not a good path to take down. One should never be afraid to ask a question, but there is a sense of wanting to ask better questions over time. So this is the best question I have. Is there a name for our age? Is there even a way of describing the exceptional nature of the era that we inhabit? In other words, aren't you weirded out? Don't you find all of this to be exceptionally odd, especially when you're thinking about it, especially when you're not only thinking about it, but even more than that, you're willing to say what you think. You're willing to say what you truly think to yourself. Not what you think you want to say, but you're able to speak as truth to yourself, which is that you don't know what is going on. Nobody knows what is going on. At least I don't, and I really don't think that anyone out there does. Now, I don't think that I'm saying that, I don't mean to say that there's no one out there that doesn't have anything to say. Like, clearly I'm throwing my penny into that well. What I mean to suggest is that when we're looking directly at our world, what we find is that the very stability of our world is being taken down from within by a series of emergencies, a series of disasters, a series of tendencies and trends and habits that have been growing before our eyes for 100 years, for 50 years, for longer than that. And what I mean is that there's a sense in which I suspect a part of the reason we really do not have a name for our age is that we have not been thinking about the reality of our age, because we've been living in a kind of fantasy world. Because what we call the political itself is a certain kind of story that offers us a certain power, but it ultimately operates as a kind of cartoon, as a kind of fantasy. And so I think that what is happening now is that the very delusions that we have are being undone. And these delusions, these mistakes, these errors in our ways of thinking go so deep that it's ridiculous to think that it's on any side, that it has anything to do with the Republican-Democrat divide. That's mistake number one I might want to suggest, because there's a sense in which they are both playing the same kind of game. And what they're doing is ultimately allowing for something that we like to think of as something we've gotten far beyond. That they're allowing, in their collusion, in their continuance of the same narrative, they're allowing the emergence of this world that is being put forward, that comes from the old world, but it's still being put forward, call it what you will, because it offers the thing that is key to the flow of finance, which is stability itself. And so the key thing that connects the Democrat and Republican split has to do with the fact that they are both compromising according to an idea that they both see as unquestionable, which is that one must allow things to keep going on without interruption. And so at a certain level, that obliterates the very democratic processes that we take for granted as being the basis of our society. And so even that is being undone by managerial powers that are attempting to keep stable something that is impossible to keep stable. And that is in many ways the modernist narratives, the stories that we're wanting to tell ourselves about what we are doing as individuals and what we are doing as a whole. And so I know that a lot of this sounds quite ridiculous because I'm speaking in quite general terms, but what I'm really attempting to speak about is my own experience since 2016, when I stepped away from my own radical proclivities, you might say. I began questioning those writers and those people close to me that were in many ways preventing me from seeing the truth, from seeing something that was deeply contrary to what I wanted to believe, to what I wanted to think. And in short, I was an anarchist, and I had seen the Bush and Obama administrations as being the same kind of absurd fantasy as I see it now, except that I saw it in very schematic, very programmatic terms. And in many ways, I voted for the first time and voted for Hillary and voting for Joe Biden as I began to sort of question my own revolutionary sensibility that this system itself was not what I thought it was. I wanted to believe in what I not thought it was, if that makes sense. And so on a certain level, I now look back and I realize in many ways how right I was prior to 2016. And so I know that that probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but I mean to paint a few details that sort of preface what I did when Trump was elected in terms of turning away from all of the radical programmatic thinking that I had. I began thinking on my own. I began trying to understand things on my own. And what I realized was that there were increasingly things that were happening that nobody thought could happen, right? That it's not about conspiracies. It's not about ghosts or UFOs. I mean, like Brexit. I mean, like the election of Trump. I mean that, like, nobody expected COVID to happen. Like, that was not predicted at all. Like, I had this radical sense of vertigo that set in, and I bring up my own, my own ideas about what politics was, partially to remind myself of how ludicrous my thinking was, but at the same time, there was an element of truth in what I had thought. And yet, what I wanted to do when Trump was elected was to step way back. I wanted to think deeply about what was going on. I wanted to understand truthfully and sympathetically and intellectually, as deeply as I could, the roots of what this MAGA movement was and what Trump was and who I was. And I ultimately, as an act of sort of intellectual honesty, wanted to be able to defend their point of view in such a way that I almost can become it, as a way of understanding what it is that has happened. And at the same time, I've also engaged in the kind of ruthless criticism of myself. I think that there is a necessary auditing of yourself and your own beliefs and assumptions. It's often was assumed by people that I was around and people that I looked up to that the nature of truth telling was to speak truth to power. You know, that what we were doing was ultimately using information as a way of dislodging those who, through ignorance, were controlling other people. And what I see now is that that's really great, but it's a shame if you're not practicing that sort of self-reflexive, self-aware critique of yourself. Like, you've got to ask yourself the same kind of questions that you're asking those in power. And I also think that there's a sense in which you have to, like, if you're really serious about this is where I come from in my own grounding, and the ways in which I turned in 2016 meant turning towards political theory, turning towards philosophy, all these books where in many ways, many of the fundamental ideas that make our world what it is are being given birth. And so there's a sense in which you engage in something that's a little bit more elevated than simply watching the news or social media and having an opinion or watching a YouTube video. I mean, when you're reading like the Federalist Papers, or you're reading Machiavelli or Aristotle or Thucydides, you're ultimately wrestling with things that are not really ancient, because you're wrestling with our contemporaneous problems. And so I not only wanted to understand myself, but to understand the other point of view. And I think that there's a sense in which you ultimately are shocked to discover what you might think in lieu of this sort of process. And one thing that I'll add that I learned was that you can never take the defensive position. Like, there's something critical in terms of ideas and thinking that demands that you as a person have to decide like what counts as a problem. You know what I mean? Like, we're often assuming that other people know what the problems are and that we learn about them. But who's to say what a problem is? I mean, you can really free yourself from the exasperation that comes with pursuing impossible things by simply saying that the question itself is not a question and that the problem itself is not a problem. And so I do think there are problems, but these are problems that I decide, in the sense that I recognize the terrifying freedom that comes with thinking. And you could say that there's a sense in which, to borrow an anarchist phrase, that the political is the local, and there's nothing more localized than the body in your own everyday life. And so I think that one thing that I did too 10 years ago was that I'd stepped way back to decide on my own what counted as worthy of political attention. And honestly, I came to a position that I don't like to talk about, because too many people are so quick to say that I told you so, or, you know, that's why I'm the way that I am. But it really has nothing to do with that. And it has to do with like seeing that the meaning and beauty of life is not out there, in the sense that it's about some big adventure where one is freeing oneself from some matrix like domination. And nor is it that what is wrong with the world is out there, right? There's a sense in which, when you are really thinking clearly, you really see that you yourself are not really free from all of that, and it's not out there. The adventure is actually right here, because it is your everyday relations that are about as political as you're ever going to get. So the very ways that you have conversation, the ways that you carry yourself, the ways that you relate to your family, that's all related to the political. But there's a even more fundamental sense that what one is wanting to see in many ways is the precarious nature of political thinking, especially when we're assuming that it's out there and that it doesn't have to do with us ourselves and the way that we're living. And there's another sense, again, when you reach that point, where one is freed by seeing that one then chooses what counts. And what I'm wanting to do is to look at how our world is highly chaotic, and yet everybody is really just acting like we're going to go back to normal. And, you know, like I said, I voted for the three, Hillary, Kamala, and Joe. But I watched Obama's podcast recently, the podcast that he did where he finally speaks about some things that he had probably had on his mind for a long time now. And I found myself connecting to him because I'm deeply connected to W.E.B. Du Bois and Martin Luther King Jr. in a fundamental way that I have, on another level, dislodged myself. And that's sort of like another side of what this essay that I'm writing about this, and it's another side of what exactly this all means. But it has to do with asking myself that basic question about what the political would mean, and also to ask the question of questions regarding how one decides what counts as an emergency, what counts as a crisis, what counts as a problem. You know, there's a sense of like framing that we have to practice, the ways that we frame our political problems, because you can't help but notice that there's not also an underlying inability to see directly, given any kind of resistance that one might have even to what I'm saying. I think that what I often discover is a sense of deep resistance, a deep insistence upon maintaining our quotidian views about what counts as politics or a political narrative, because we sort of almost think that we're going to lose something if we were to question what we really think about the processes that are going on right now. But I'm here to say that I don't think there's anything to lose. And I think there is something hilarious about having voted for Democratic contenders and believing in a constitutional liberalism and just seeing that what's happening in the world is completely removed from all of that, right? There's a sense in which I'm trying to suggest that I'm torn myself, because in 2025, I stopped believing in something that had been so deep to me for 10 years. But I also started realizing that prior to 2016, I was sort of onto something in my own my own ability to see critically what a lot of people in the MAGA movement sort of claim as their own. And what I mean by that is that the MAGA people, as the shapeshifters that they are, were able to assimilate a lot of things from the left. That's quite obvious. And there's a sense in which the things that they were able to assimilate are things that I remember speaking about on a daily basis in 2008 to 2011. And it had to do with, in many ways, what they consider to be the betrayal of the elites. It's so obvious that he's betraying everyone. But I realized that perhaps I was wrong to hedge my own bets. Perhaps I was wrong to want to defend this idea of there being constitutional norms. Perhaps there's something to be said for entering a kind of rebirth within our world that would finally allow a different kind of way of being to exist. That's the revolutionary drive that I think is natural to feel. And it's sort of held in check by the underlying immediate sense that, no, that is not what this means. It means something else. And I think we have to have courage to explore this middle space between our extreme overreactions, to explore the more subtle space of everyday life, and to be willing to let go of all the ideas and tacit presuppositions and ideas that are like underneath our beliefs, that we're not challenging. And without even going into them, I like to address the very idea itself of undoing beliefs. And so much of my thinking has to do with thinking philosophically about politics or science or art. And it's often said that there's no point in bringing philosophy into politics. But I think that when philosophy is infused with the urgent questions of life that are not merely personal questions, but are social questions, when one has what is sometimes called an ontology of the ethical, to follow the philosopher Levinas, there is a sense in which nothing is more crucial than the philosophical at this moment, because it doesn't mean, at least to me, critical theory or this like stupid classicism that the right is proposing, that is to them connected to a Christian tradition, that's ultimately connected to a Jewish eschaton. That's not my tradition at all. So what one has to defend is a deeper, more ruthless kind of idea about what philosophy can mean and what the examined life can mean, especially when we're playing on this idea that it doesn't merely mean speaking courageously to people that we disagree with, but speaking courageously to ourselves and asking ourselves those deep kind of questions that ultimately can turn a life, not in ways that make it easier, because so much of what philosophy does is to make better by making more difficult. You know, to engage in a philosophical, political life is to enter a kind of chaos that most people would prefer not to even think about. But that's because perhaps they've lost taste for life itself. I don't know. But I'm John Edward Willie, and I love you guys.